as I think about that arc of happiness, I very purposefully have said, I don't want to experience that dip. Will that mean later in life I'm unhappy? Only if I let it. Only if I don't engage in all these other behaviors that we outline. And I'd say the same for you as a parent. This can take your health, wealth, and time. But by listening to this, by paying attention to these rules, by being cognizant of health, wealth, and time, even with your kids, you will be more likely to overcome the natural deficits of being a parent simply by the fact that you're paying attention.
Hello and welcome to the Optimal Agency Podcast. My name is Patrick Cummings, joined as always by John Gilson. Together with you, we are exploring the ideas of agency, diving deep to discover a set of guidelines on how each of us can best operate in the day-to-day to maximize our personal autonomy, professional freedom, and ultimately our positive impact on the world. Thank you so much for tuning into the show this week. What's up, Gilson?
I'm amazed right now, bud. My cat somehow, while we've been recording this podcast, moved her bed at least 3 feet and got back in it. So she appears to have teleported during our recording session, which is pretty neat.
The teleporting cat. My kids would love that. We're coming over again. We're going to see this teleporting cat. They'll spend all day watching and waiting.
We'll make it just keep watching, Miles. Keep watching. She's going to do it.
He'll sit there for a while, too. All right, cool. I'm excited to have this chat with you. Every other week on the show, we talk through a question that was sent to us by a listener. That's what we've got this week. And then every other week, we do a longer discussion on how we can own our lives by becoming optimal agents. We will be doing that next week. If you would like to get a question into a future episode of ours, the best way, there's 2 ways to do it. The best way, optimalagency.co/questions. There's a form there. Submit it. We'll get it. We'll add it to our list. The other way you can get a question into the queue is simply respond to any one of our weekly newsletters that we send out every single Tuesday morning. And you can get that at optimalagency.co/newsletter. Links to both of those are in the show notes. Okay. My friend, we've got a question from Alan. This is an old question that we're going to solve finally once and for all for everybody. Ready? Okay. So Alan is 38. He's married for 3 years, run his own business for 13 plus years, and never had the desire to have kids. His wife feels similarly, although more open to it. This is his question or his thought. How do we deploy agency for this life-changing decision when the societal constructs and expectations run as deep as tectonic plates, from Hollywood movies to all types of cultural influences, family, etc.? I notice many men and women seem to have kids because it's the next step, quote unquote, the next step, or it was quote unquote time, or because they lack a deep purpose or meaning in their day-to-day life. At the same time, I've wondered if we'll regret the decision at 48, 58, and 68 to not have kids. And I do believe that some parents, though they never admit it, have some regret in their decision to have kids. So, as I said, let's finally solve this, and so that people don't have to ask themselves anymore, ever again, should I have kids?
Yeah, here we are. Alan, thanks for the question. Runs deep as tectonic plates. That was very poetic.
That's a sentence written by somebody who has enough time because he doesn't have kids. He's got enough time to think of that.
He's got enough time. Yeah, and we'll ignore the fact that tectonic plates are relatively surface based on the Earth, and we will go deep. So thanks, Alan. Okay, so I don't have children. I'm 43 years old. You
have cats, though, as we've established.
Yeah, we've got many cats. And we're not any sadder for it, to be honest. Mm-hmm. Patrick, you have 2 beautiful sons.
I've got 2.
Yeah, and why don't you talk a little bit about them just so people have some context here?
Yeah, I've got a 6.5 and a 3.5. The 6.5 is almost about to lose his first tooth, which is just for some reason freaking me out. I don't know why. But the loose and he just shakes it and it's just like, I don't know why. It's bugging me.
Have you ever had the dream where your teeth fall out?
No, I have not.
I've had that dream many times. It's disconcerting. Yeah.
So anyway, so we've got, so he's in first grade, little guy's in preschool, and that's where we're at.
Yeah. So we are, at least half of us are qualified to answer this question. You can decide which half. And so I, not having kids, view myself as, frankly, unbiased here. Nobody's pulling me towards saying kids are the greatest thing that ever happened because I have no experience. And so I went to the science. I said, well, okay. And I do have a bachelor's in psychology. And so, of course, I immediately went to the psychology literature and didn't ask about kids. I looked at regret. Because I think this is the basis of Alan's question, which is,
absolutely,
if we have kids, will we regret it or not?
Yep.
And so,
how can we mitigate regret up front?
Yep. And let's talk about what the literature says about both of those things. So the first is we regret acts of omission to a much higher degree than acts of commission. In other words, we regret the things we don't do more than we regret the things we do. Why? Because we have a very robust ability to justify our actions.
Mm-hmm.
And so we know, first of all, just on that basis, you're probably more likely to not regret having kids because that's acting than you are not having kids because that's omission. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Second point of psychology, we tend to be more satisfied with irreversible decisions than we are with reversible decisions, even though we express a preference for reversible decisions.
Say that one more time.
Yeah, sure. And let me try and say it more simply.
Mm-hmm.
You will be more satisfied if it's a one-way door. You go through it and it's done. Then if it's a
Made the decision,
two-way
you can't
door,
undo it.
You can't undo it. Okay, if you can't undo it, you'll be more satisfied. The psychology, of course, here is done on presumably white male undergraduates, and it is very simple. People who are given a thing and or a choice of multiple things and are told that their decision is irreversible express later more satisfaction with the thing they chose than people who are then given the option to trade that thing in. Dan Gilbert, who has a great podcast, 10% Happier, is also a PhD in psychology and a research psychologist. This was actually one of his studies done on photography students. So, if we're more satisfied with irreversible decisions, I can't think of any more irreversible than I had a kid, right? My mom used to say, I brought you into this world, I can take you out of it, but I don't think...
But she has yet to do that.
Yeah, she hasn't done it yet. So on that same basis, you are probably going to be more psychologically satisfied with having children than not. Okay, fine. That's psychology. What does the actual data say? Well, we have a Gallup poll from, I believe, 2013 on parents and regret. And the way that they framed it is they asked American adults over the age of 45, if you could do it over again, how many children would you have? And they had two groups, those who had kids and those who didn't have kids. And they were asked to choose. If I could do it again, I would have 0 kids. I would have 1 kid, 2 kids, 3 kids, 4 kids, 5 kids. And I think it might have kept going after
6
that.
Or more.
6 or more.
It was 6 and more was the last category. Yep.
Yeah. If I could who says it? If I could do it all again, I'd have like 1,000,005 kids. Yeah. Okay. So what does the data actually say? Amongst those who have children over the age of 45, 7% say I would have 0. I think that's a pretty good marker of regret. If I could, 7% say 0. And if you look at some of the international data, it skews as high into war-torn and other places where things are truly bad, as high as 18%. But in no case do the majority of parents regret having their kids. It's mid single digits, really. Mid to high single digits regret having their kids. In that same survey, of those who currently don't have kids, 44% said they would have 0, which means they don't regret their decision to remain childless, which means 56% of respondents did regret their decision. In other words, there's a coin flip that if you don't have kids, essentially 50-50, that you're going to regret it. What does that point to? Again, it's an act of commission, not omission. And to Alan's point, parents are probably pretty loath to admit they regret having kids, but there's no reason for them to have lied on this survey, right? It's an anonymous survey. And so the 7% who said they regret having kids are probably being honest. And so by all of those bases, again, you're better off probably having children if you want to avoid subsequent regret. So let's talk about parents who do regret having their children and why they regret having their children. So in a meta-analysis of 12 studies on parental regret, the finding was that there are about 5 key contributors to parental regret. They are marital status. In other words, if you are not married, you're more likely to regret having children. Financial status. If you're poor, you're more likely to regret having children. special needs. If your child is born with any of a panoply of special needs, you're more likely to regret having children. The other is if you have missed opportunities to develop, and that's either personally or professionally. Okay, so those were kind of the expressions of parents with regret. They tended to be relatively unattached, unpaired, less financially well off, and to have kids who demanded more than, let's say, the normal amount of resources, time, and attention through special needs. Okay. So what does that point to? Well, it starts to point to a prescription for when and how you should have kids, and we'll get to that in a minute. But what I'd like to get to next is an article by Neil Reese and Amy Somerville called What We Regret Most. And you'll forgive me for not having the methodology at hand, but they stack ranked the opportunities that you'll regret giving up. Just generally, this has nothing to do with kids. This is just what do people regret. And so the first is, and the highest ranked is education. Either I didn't get the education I wanted, the level of educational attainment, or I didn't learn the thing I really wanted to learn. The next is career. I didn't have the career I wanted, or I didn't bring the one I had as far as I can. The next is romance, and I assume this is primarily I made bad romantic choices, or I didn't go after the person. I didn't go after the one that got away. Then self-development, and that actually rounds out with leisure. But self-development, of course, being a catch-all for I didn't do the things I wanted to do. So I think this data stacks up. If you're going to regret being relatively unattached or poor when you have kids, don't. In other words, have kids when you're married, when you're financially stable, and when both parents are at an age where the risk of developmental and fetal problems is low. Okay, and so I actually went and looked up the research for, well, what ages are those where that risk is low? And it seems very uniform that men's risk of fathering a child with special needs escalates rapidly over the age of 40. And women's risk of having a child similarly accelerates over 40, but truly accelerates between 45 and above. Okay. And so what does that say? You should have those kids when you're under 40, mom and dad. So Alan, you're 38, you ticking clock, pal. And only do it if you have the education and the career that you want. Okay, so basically this says become a parent when you're ready to become a parent, and there's a set amount of criteria here, and you're most likely going to regret not becoming a parent more than you'll regret becoming a parent. Now, I believe Alan said, well, how would you frame this in the context of optimal agency?
Yep. So
we have to frame this in health, wealth, and time. Okay, let's start with wealth. Kids are expensive. But when you, and I found another study, I feel like this is like John read PubMed. This is the John read PubMed episode. Married parents are wealthier than all other cohorts of people. Married parents have more net worth than unmarried parents, than single people, than cohabitating unmarried kids with or without kids. So if you've got kids and you're married, you're richer than everybody else. Now, that can be stacked up, and they did a great multivariate analysis here. That can be stacked up to just one fact. Married parents own homes. By the time you control for age, demographics, location, etc., that's the only thing that matters. Married parents own homes. So it's a wash. It's actually a wash. You should ask yourself, though, how much does it cost to raise a kid? Well, the last time I was able to find good data was from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, of all places, who probably wants your kid to eat more soy and wheat. I don't know. But they said that it cost $233,000 in 2015. I went ahead and used the CPI, Consumer Price Index inflation calculator, to bring that to $2023. It's about $306,000 from 0 to age 18.
Over the lifetime of when you're the primary caretaker?
0 to 18. Yeah, that's 0 to 18. So obviously, if you're going to pay for college, post-grad education, et cetera, you're on your own there. That'll obviously skyrocket that. So at the end, it's expensive to raise a kid, but at the end of the day, if you're a married parent, you'll probably do just fine. Own that house. Okay,
Really
let's talk about health.
Yep.
There's an advantage late and a disadvantage early. So a lot of the research points towards young parents, and I assume that means more that the kid's young than the parents are young. But young parents have a low tendency to engage in vigorous exercise, and they tend to have a nutritional deficit in their consumption. But later on in life, they have improved happiness and literally improved outcomes as measured by catastrophic health problems like heart disease, heart attack, and stroke. If you are a biological parent, you have less likelihood of those things occurring, literally. And of course, we can fit a narrative to that. And Pat, maybe this is a good time for you to chime in on that life course of having a kid. You've gotten from 0 to 6.5. What has it done to your health and your wealth?
I think the first 6 years are, it's easy for me to say this because it's all I've got, but my sense of it is that the first 5 to 6 years are the hardest across all of those things, across certainly time, but across health and across wealth to the degree that it is, because kids are expensive and they eat a lot of bananas. I don't know if you knew that. We are constantly buying bananas. And so I think it's one of those things that once they get to a certain age and they're in school all day and you're not paying for babysitters 3 times a week or 4 times, there's a little bit more breathing room there. But the first couple of years are certainly a tax on all 3 of those elements of agency, without question.
Yeah. Yeah.
There are many times, I was thinking about this in preparation for this conversation. There are many times where I'm 30 minutes into bath time and I'm just sitting in the bathroom okay, let's just wrap this thing up here. And I'm like, John is not doing this right now. John is reading a book he's really been interested in, or, whatever John might be doing. So there are points where, I think about this idea of regret and the 7% and Alan's question. And there are moments where it's really easy to think about what you could be doing if not this, what you could have done if not what we did for the last 5 years. But there's an element of joy and there's an element of purpose that is, in my experience, invisible without kids.
Yeah.
It doesn't exist until you get there. And so are there, and that's kind of one of the things I wanted to chat with you about or ask you about, this idea of regret. There's short-term regret, and that's maybe not even the right word, but there are short-term moments where you think, what the hell's John doing right now? Because it's not bath time.
Right.
And then there's long-term regret. There's kind of what you've been talking about, which is looking back on my life, do I regret this? And those things can sometimes be at odds, where in the middle of it, it's really hard. And somebody who we like and we pay attention to, Scott Galloway, points out that if you look at the trajectory of life, it's kind of like a smile, where people's self-reports of happiness are really high early on in life, and it dips through this period of 30s, 40s, and then it goes back up in the mid 40s, 50s, and 60s. And I think a lot of that has to do with the short-term challenges of, in the case of this conversation, the short-term challenges of child rearing starts to be primarily all joy and benefit as they get older, as you get older, as you cement yourself in work, career, all these other things. And so, but that dip does certainly exist. And if we only look at the dip, well, then kids don't make it a lick of sense.
Right.
But the thing of it is we don't just look at the dip. To your point, the data, when people do research on this, they don't just look at the dip. When we look at it, when we think about it, we don't just look at the dip. We look at the whole full spectrum of life. And so as long as you do that, as long as we're doing that, I think you get the fuller picture for sure.
One of the things that is interesting is the arc of the child, of your kid, of them. They early on, they need and love you so much, but they depend on you so much. And you've got boys, and you'll find this out in the next 8 years or so. They're going to start to fight you for independence more and more and more. You're going to become an idiot. You're not going to know anything about anything. And it's going to get really challenging. right? And in 8 years, you're going to be about 50, which is about where happiness for men who have kids hits its bottom. Hits its bottom when you have a bunch of asshole teenagers running around, right? That's when it happens, right? But then you're going to have a kid who graduated from high school and then found something amazing in college and then became an actual real human being running around the earth, who now becomes somebody you can have friendship and connection with. And so I think that's where it starts to confer health. Is it's a built-in social network of someone that you love more than anyone else. And you get more of those people, right? Where Annie and I will never have another person that we can love like family, except for our current family. And they'll age out. They'll get old. They'll get old with us, or they'll get old before us. And we can have relationships with our nieces and nephews. But if we remain childless, and we have all intent to, our social network will be tight acquaintances and loose acquaintances. Yours will be somebody who would take a bullet for you and pay the mortgage. and that's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. As I think about that arc of happiness, I very purposefully have said, I don't want to experience that dip. And will that mean later in life I'm unhappy? Only if I let it. Only if I let it. Only if I don't engage in all these other behaviors that we outline. And I'd say the same for you as a parent. Like, this can take your health, wealth, and time. But by listening to this, by paying attention to these rules, by being cognizant of health, wealth, and time, even with your kids, you will be more likely to overcome the natural deficits of being a parent simply by the fact that you're paying attention.
Yeah, I love that. I want to just bring up one thing that I'd love your take on, because I can hear the criticism is not the right word, but I can hear the 30-year-old saying, yeah, but I'm still paying student loans. Yeah, but I haven't really fully established my career yet. Yeah, but owning a home in this environment is so hard and so expensive and so impossible to us. But at the same time, sort of this little algorithm you gave us of like, have kids when you're married, when you're financially secure, when you've got a house, all these things, like,
and be less than 40.
And be less than 40. That's exactly. So there's a window. And again, I'm just raising what I think some people will say, which is like, that window is so small and so hard to nail, because it's going to take me till I'm 38 to be financially secure. It's going to take me till 30. I'm not getting married yet. I'm 32. I'm not married yet. Like, all these. And so is there something about the current context that we live in that's worth mentioning as it relates to this sort of, moment in time in which it is highly unlikely that you will regret having kids if you do it now with these conditions?
Okay. The healthier you are, the more I think this age limit is movable. In other words, that's an awful lot of data. It's based on tens of thousands of people. I'm guessing they weren't all building their cardiovascular capacity and muscle mass, not eating sugar or drinking alcohol, and eating unprocessed food and cooking their own meals. So your biological age matters more than your chronological age. Whether that concept is valid or not, I have anecdotal evidence it's valid. You may have the health of a 35-year-old when you're 45. Okay. Now, what you have to ask yourself is really simple. If you want kids with your whole heart, you're not likely to regret having them no matter what your financial situation is. If you're in a situation like Alan is, where you're much more tilted in the other direction, I don't really want kids and my partner's ambivalent, you would be better off to stack up all of these other things. Be financially well off, be married, own that home, right? Because those are going to be additional buffers against the regret that you already naturally are assuming you're going to get and you're going to feel. Is it hard to own a home? Yes. Is it hard to be financially stable? Yes. Is it hard to get a good career? Yes. Should that be an excuse? No. And I think that's one of the core things that we can put out here on the Optimal Agency podcast. I believe, and you could level any criticism at this you care to, and I shall refute it, you are in control of your life. If you want to be financially well off, it will involve sacrifice, and you need to make those sacrifices. If owning a home is part of that equation for you, it's hard, and you need to make the sacrifices to get it done. If you want to have a good career early on when you're 25, instead of running around trying to find yourself, find a career, make some money, and invest it. And the sooner you can do that, the more likely it is that you'll get to child rearing age and be well off. And so my sympathy for those things are hard is limited. I acknowledge they're hard, but I acknowledge that you are strong and you can do it if you want to. And frankly, the earlier you start, the better.
Love it. All right, Alan, thank you so much for the question. That was great. John, thank you. I enjoyed that very much. If you would like to get a question into a future episode, one more time, optimalagency.co/questions is the best way to do so. The link is in the show notes as well as many other things, so check that out. Thank you for your ratings and your reviews. Thank you, of course, for tuning into the show this week. John and I will be back next week for another episode of the Optimal Agency Podcast.